Hey everyone, in this video I want to go over some of the concepts that you encounter in this reading, Lesson 2 Actions by Williams and Colomb in particular. So we know that this reading focuses on revising your sentences in order to tell a story so that your sentences have a clear character and a clear action. Well, the reading also addresses that one of the main culprits that prevent our sentences from having a clear story to tell is the nominalization. Some of you may be familiar with that word, some of you may not. A nominalization is a grammatical term that refers to any noun that hides or buries within it a verb, adjective, or some other part of speech. So here are some examples. Creation, create is buried in that word. Solicitation, solicit is buried. Eminence buries eminent, distraction buries distract, clumsiness buries clumsy, and redundancy buries redundant. You could also see that the word nominalization is also a nominalization. To nominify, I'm going to have to look into if that's the exact verb in there, but another tip to finding nominalizations are these endings to the words. They usually tell you if a word is a nominalization. Shun, T-I-O-N, ence, E-N-C-E, ness, and a Y ending, like redundancy or discovery, for example. Okay, so what's the problem with nominalizations? On the face of it, nothing. These are very useful words. We need them in our language. But when you start to pile them on top of one another, things get confusing. So here's a sentence I made from all of these nominalizations in a single sentence. The creation of the distraction of eminence led to the clumsiness of her solicitation, provoking redundancy. That sentence is very confusing. I have very little idea of what that sentence says. It's not a very good sentence for communicating clearly or for telling a story. So what do we do when we have sentences that are filled with nominalizations like this? How do we fix them? Well, I took this sentence that I really just assembled from these verbs, from these nominalizations, and I tried to make this sentence tell a clearer story by revising it. The government created a distraction by introducing an eminent scientist to the public. This scientist, however, very clumsily solicited information that most organizations already knew. The government's mistake led to many redundant efforts. Okay, so I had to supply a lot of details that are missing in this sentence in order for this to make sense. And that's one reason that sentences that are really filled with nominalizations are difficult, because they often omit information. They omit the actor, the character, the person doing something, and they omit the action. We don't really know what's happening because it's a sentence full of nouns, and nouns by their very nature do not do things. That's the verb's job. So these sentences do not communicate very well. In this revised version, I created a character, the government, and I used verbs to show that these characters were doing something. The government created a distraction. They introduced an eminent scientist. The scientist, another character, clumsily solicited information. Notice that there are still a few nominalizations in this group of sentences, distraction, information. But these sentences are much clearer because they still tell a story and they don't become overshadowed by too many nominalizations. So this is the thing that I'm really encouraging you to look for in your writing, is the buildup of too many nominalizations, which you can recover by eliminating many of the nominalizations. So let me reiterate that a single nominalization in a sentence is often very useful. Like above, we used the word distraction. That was really useful here. Nominalizations perform a key role in our language. Once those nominalizations start to pile up, it leads to abstraction. We don't know who is doing what, and that makes the sentence harder to understand, because believe it or not, as smart as any of us are, our brains still like to hear stories that have clear characters and actions. When we remove all of those things, it's much more difficult for our brain to grasp on to a concept. So how do you do this in your own writing? How do you work towards this goal of eliminating or reducing nominalizations? Well, first of all, write as you normally do when you're drafting something. Because the worst thing you can do to yourself when you're writing is to create any roadblocks that prevents you from generating content. We all know what it's like to stare at the blank page and feel incredibly overwhelmed by that. You don't need another thing against you by saying, I can't use nominalizations. I really don't know how to write a sentence without them. No. We don't want that. So just go ahead and write as you normally would, because the process that we're talking about here is a revision process. This is something we do after we've composed a draft. Okay, so you've written as you normally do. Now we go back and we analyze your sentences. How many nominalizations can you find? You might want to circle them. And again, to find them, use these endings to locate them: shun, ens, ness, and y. Now, you want to dig out the verb or the adjective or the other word that is within your nominalizations. For example, I already dug out the words here. In creation, the verb is create. In solicitation, the word is solicit. You want to dig out the words that are buried in those nominalizations and use those verbs to tell a story, which is what I did in this sentence. Instead of the creation of the distraction, I said the government created a distraction. So now creation is a verb. It's back to doing things the way it likes to do things, and we can see something happening. So once you dig out the verb or the adjective, which tells you what's really going on in the sentence, then you can use that information to revise your sentence so it tells a story. So it's no longer kind of trapped in the stasis of nominalization, but is in fact telling a story with clear characters and actions. Okay, so your task now is to try this out yourself. Choose some sentences in your own draft where you see nominalizations at work and revise them and post them to this week's discussion board.